Welcome to Criticism and Value 9. For those of you who are new to the platform, Criticism and Value is a discussion series about the criticism and value of art through a series of intimate conversations about the work and practice of national and international artists. The series continues with a conversation between myself, host Ernest Arthur Bryant III, LPI, and American artist Julia Rooney.
Even though we are not physically in the gallery, I do have here a 2-scale model of the gallery, which serves as a means of introduction of the show, in addition to the computer screen, which I will be sharing myself. I'm going to begin with a passage from the book album, and in particular, it's a passage of an email exchange letter between me and fellow artist and friend Sarah Stern. And this email was dated December 19th, 2022. So I will share my screen as I read this. Dear Stern, the 1940s begin floor 4 and end floor 5. That is, they are the left bracket of newer work and the right bracket of older work. Mondrian could have been on either, but he is on floor 5. I suppose a designation that he is the end of older work. I learned today that escalators can switch between going up and down. I often forget that stairs do not have an inherent direction. It is just the movement you choose to use when on them. Escalators direct traffic, and today the escalators connecting 4 to 5 are both going down. I am told that half of floor 5 is closed because the lights are out. They can't have people looking at art in the dark, or is it a safety hazard? I find my way to an elevator that takes me to the half that is open. I like that one. It reminds me of Pac-Man and Wiggles at the same time. That's pretty close. It's called the Broadway Boogie Woogie. The guard comes over and asks if I am working on a school paper. I tell her I am an artist, and I'm sitting on the floor because there is no bench in this gallery. She does not ask me to leave because I have a laptop. She tells me she writes too, and that sitting on the floor is good for you. Do you take pictures too? I do, but it doesn't tell me everything. I am below the painting on its left side. I cannot imagine it ever being unstretched. The nails in the stretcher bars look so permanent, painted over with white paint that is now cracking like the surface. But on the bottom edge, there are lips of yellow peeking over, which tells me maybe it has been unstretched and restretched, but not quite perfectly. Who looks at the bottom of a painting? It is easier to see cracks from this angle and the shadows of paint on top of itself. There is a spot in the red that looks like the surface of a basketball or an unwaxed orange. I've just taken you on a walk from floor 4 to floor 5 at MoMA and ended in Gallery 512, where Piet Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie is installed, amidst other works of his and those of his contemporaries, including your own Marlowe Moss, composition in black and white number 4, dated 1949. This is not a talk about either of those artists or about sound. This is not a talk about those paintings, but it's rather a talk about the embodied experience of looking at a painting with one's own eyes, looking closely, and also looking with one's body, which is also about feeling and feeling a painting. The reason I started with Broadway Boogie Woogie is because it is a painting that I have consistently gone back to and that has always invited me to look in this fashion, to move close, to step back, to look from far away and from all angles. And every single time that I've done that, it has surprised me. I started visiting this painting in 2017 when I was a graduate student at Yale. Right now I'm playing a video of Freight and Volume Gallery where album is on view. And I wanted to start with a walk, again, both of this gallery space and of MoMA, as a reminder of how when you come to a painting, it's not just about arriving at the painting, it's about all the things that happen before and all the things that happen after, and how those things affect the way we interpret that painting, or frankly, any experience at all. That there's always a peripheral amount of space and of information that is part of what it is that we actually read and respond to in that painting. I think it's ironic, but also perhaps appropriate that this talk is occurring on Zoom on this very cold February day, because it's actually a large part of how this body of work is about, this idea of a hybrid condition in which we are always experiencing the world through the in-person reality of it, and also through the screens that have come to mediate so much of our life. And as an artist, I think about that with regards to painting, and what does it mean for a painting to exist in the real world, and then to also exist on one's phone, and also exist on a screen, and how the production of painting and the circulation of painting and the experience of it fundamentally now is this hybrid condition. And at the core of the show is that question of what does it mean to look? How is a painting made? Why does a painting end up looking the way it does? And what is the DNA or the substructure of that painting? So here we are on Zoom. This is a screenshot of what you may recognize as an infinity mirror, and that's a condition that occurs sometimes when you share your whole screen, and then the screen continues to sort of mirror itself. This is a screenshot of this happening in Google Meet, and it's a condition that actually began this painting here, which is the central painting when you walk in the gallery that you see from afar. As I'm walking backwards and sort of zooming out, as I say, the squares of the painting become evident, and they really only become evident when you step far enough back from them that you can sort of see the entire, the scope of the painting. When you're up too close, the squares within the squares within the squares within the squares don't really read. So the farther you step, the kind of more legible those squares become. And again, it's an abstract painting, but it came from that sort of source material of the condition of being on a Zoom call and seeing your own computer reflected back at you, which is also something I think is very present in social media and the ways that our content continues to sort of feed the content that then we are watching. We're leaving the gallery and entering the street. And from the street, you see this painting in the window. And this is the only painting in the show that has an actual name as opposed to a number. All of the other paintings are numbered in a somewhat generic fashion. So here's a view of the gallery street. And I wanted to have a painting that would exist for people who may not enter the actual space for whatever reason. Either they're not interested in going inside to look at art, they're just passing by, the gallery is closed, maybe it's a weekend, it's after hours. I wanted there to be an experience for the passerby to still experience art. So this painting album, which is the QR code painting in the upper right, it sits in the window. And you can try this right now. If you're all on computers, you can put your phone up to the computer screen and the QR code scans and it takes you to a video, which is here. This is a stop motion animation, which I produced by taking individual photographs of every brushstroke. There are over 1,000 photographs, and then compiling it into this animated video that basically shows the production of that painting. It's a kind of recursive way of working in which the final image, which is that QR code, actually reveals its own making. And this is not generally the way I work. I never really know where a painting is going to end. But in this case, the only thing I knew is how it would end. And it would end with this sort of key into its own production. I am very grateful to the work of Sly Watts, who compiled these images into this animation. Sly Watts is an artist who I met in New Orleans when I was in residence, and very, very diligently helped me in the production of this. So I just want to acknowledge his help and his labor. So when you're making this, or when I was making this, there is no point in the making that the QR code works. And then there is a moment when it suddenly does work, and when your phone reads it, as you might say, it registers it as an image that can work. So as I said, this is not normally how I make paintings. The way I make paintings usually is that I don't know how they're going to end. And in this case, I'm going to walk backwards. Instead of going from start to finish, I'm going to walk us back from finish to start. So this is one of the pieces in the gallery. It's titled OBJ 0923. And the next few images show the kind of various points of production for this particular painting. This is me standing on the floor with it completely unstretched. So there was a moment where it was taken off the stretcher bars. I often say that paintings they enter moments of crisis throughout their own making, and those moments are sometimes the most productive moments, because they kind of allow you to abandon your intention or your kind of overdetermined ideas about what the painting should have been. This is when it was on the stretcher bar. So stretcher bar, no stretcher bar. Again, an early stage of the painting. Me standing again. And as you can start to tell, this early stage of the painting reveals that actually it's made up of hundreds of tiny squares that are all old paintings that were cut up and sort of resuscitated. So this painting does end up looking like an image when you see it, but it's actually a combination of these tiny, tiny little squares that are each 2 by 2 inches that sort of become quilted together. So they're stitched, they're collaged, they're also bracketed with these sort of metal clasps. And this 2-inch kind of base unit came about in 2020. Well, I will say 2020, but it ultimately had a public life in 2021 with Arts and Leisure, which was a space that Freight and Volume had uptown in Manhattan. And we had a show January, February of 2021, when, we were in a very different moment of the pandemic. And this entire show consisted of 2-inch paintings. The idea of the show came about in a conversation that I had with Nick, actually about a year prior to the show coming about, in which we were talking about Instagram. And he asked me, what's your Instagram? And I said, I don't have Instagram. And we had this long conversation about why I didn't have Instagram. And I said, I make big paintings, and I don't really want my paintings to be on a phone, a tiny phone where they're really small. And if I did do that, I would want them to be 2-inch paintings. And there was this moment of sort of excitement around this idea of a whole show of 2-inch paintings. And I'm grateful to that conversation for beginning us on this journey. So that whole show, again, consisted of these very, very tiny paintings. It happened at a time when a lot of people weren't going out to see art in person because of, again, where the pandemic was. And so again, I really wanted to create a way for people to enter the gallery without having to enter the gallery. And so there was, again, this QR code painting in the window that you could scan, and the QR code led to a link on Instagram where all of these tiny little paintings were uploaded. And again, the experience of seeing them in person versus seeing them on your phone was actually very much to scale. It was the same to see them, at least in size, in these two different capacities. The physical experience of seeing it, for you shared this with me, was that, you didn't really know how big they were, or how small they were, I should say, until you were actually in the space. And that was a kind of strange experience for the body to realize, like, oh, this is how small my phone really is. I played with installing the paintings in the architecture such that it would call attention to the sort of nuances of the space, the kind of idiosyncrasies of this gallery, which was very small, had a lot of nuances. I hung the paintings up high to kind of engage people's point of view, so that they would not just look what's in front of them, but also high up. I paired some together as diptychs, and all the while I was also making what I said originally, that I'd make pretty large paintings. And so I was also making these 6-foot paintings. And I began sort of making these really small and really large paintings at once. And I would say, from a conceptual standpoint, that gesture came again from thinking about our relationship to handheld devices at this moment in time, but also our relationship to physical bodies, as this idea of 6 foot of social distance became so ingrained in us. So the paintings that were large almost acted as this sort of benchmark of distance between one person and another, but then the things in combination again became this sort of doubling of the handheld phone device. And I was making the big paintings first, and then making small paintings of those big paintings second. So sometimes people have asked me, are the 2-inch paintings studies for the big paintings? And I said, actually, it's the other way around. The 2-inch paintings are sometimes almost copies. They're like miniature versions of the big paintings. There's a practice that Duchamp had, where he would make miniature versions of his work, and that was sort of in the back of my mind. But again, it was this idea that if you saw them on a screen, they would look somewhat similar, but if you saw them in reality, that's actually the scale shift between the two. And here's that painting, the small one, actually installed at Freight and Volume, and then to the right is another 6-foot painting. When I originally designed this talk, this computer screen that I would have been presenting on was measuring 20.5 inches across and 11.5 inches high. And I knew that there would be some people in the gallery physically looking at that screen, and then there would be some people zooming in. And so for the people who were looking at this presentation on a screen in the gallery, I produced these slides to scale. So should this have been on that size monitor, this would have been a 2-inch painting at scale. And all of these are excerpts of paintings that surround that 2-inch painting, also at scale. So as you can tell, much of the painting is cropped out. Much of the painting is cropped out. In this case, this is a 10-inch painting. You get the whole 10 inches within that size of a monitor. And here is the actual installation view of those 4 paintings. One of the things that was really essential to me in producing this work was envisioning them as a kind of choreography across a physical gallery, and in particular, this physical gallery. I knew that these paintings were going to this space, hence my 2-scale model, which I made. And so I wanted there to be a sort of dance of your eye from left to right, wherein the 2 inches almost became like excerpts. And all of the 2-inch paintings were either kind of close-ups or standing back. So they're kind of zooming in and zooming out. And you can sort of tell that there's this central 2-inch window in the center of this sort of dark painting on the left, and then to the right, etc. Here again is a close-up of these two paintings existing together. And putting a large painting next to a small painting, I also envisioned as an invitation for people to have to move their body. You know, if you can enter a room and everything is the same size, it's very easy to just sort of take a scan and keep moving or not get up close to the thing. But if there's something that you could not see from 20 feet away, it does invite that movement of yourself. And when you get closer to the big painting, something else is sort of revealed or discovered. And that's my hope, is that there's this constant play, this back and forth, in which the viewing of a painting is actually a very active experience, as opposed to this sort of passive scrolling or passive scanning around. Here's another view of the paintings in the gallery, and what I'm, again, talking about with this choreography from left to right. This one painting, which I would like to, again, kind of give a background of its own production. I'll show an early version of this painting. So this is the sort of underpainting. I should mention that all of these are oil paint, which is a medium that allows for a lot of layering and depth over time. They're all very built up paintings. And again, this may look familiar. I spent so much time looking at the Broadway Boogie Woogie, both in person, but also online. And I became really interested in how different this particular painting by Mondrian is when you see it up close, in person, and then when you see it on a screen. And I started thinking about what is lost on a screen, and this idea of data loss. Data loss, not just being in the sort of traditional sense of when you like have a JPEG that loses information the more times you open it, but also the data loss of one's idea of it or one's conception of it. So the way I thought about the making of this painting is that it was a reproduction of Mondrian's piece at 50 DPI, which is 50 dots per inch. And it looks like a pixelated image, but ironically, the further you get away from it, the more legible it becomes. So the two start to look similar as you get further and further and further away. And yet you lose the idea of what it is as a painting the further you get away from it, because you don't actually get that relationship to surface. So it's this kind of catch-22. Do you look from far away and kind of see it better, or do you look from close up and actually understand what it is? And I'm not really arriving at a conclusion, but it's a question that I'm posing. And for me, this painting began as that question for myself. How can I sort of exist in these two different spaces, and this kind of conundrum? Do I lose the data, or do I lose the surface? This is a painting from my studio, a photograph from my studio, showing it and sort of the process of my making it. And as I said, this was a early part of what this painting ultimately became. So it obviously transformed a great deal over the course of its making. Another example of that is this painting to the right. This painting began in this condition. It is a latex pour, which you can sort of discern on the surface. It's a kind of a shiny enamel latex surface. And then there are these tiny 2-inch excerpts that were actually physical canvases that I affixed to the surface. And it was, again, another way of thinking about data loss, thinking about what is lost when you only get to see a tiny portion of a larger image. The 2-inch kind of base unit or common denominator, again, came out of this relationship that I've been exploring with the phone as that kind of reference. And I started this painting as, again, like a thought experiment of like, what happens when you remove most of an image? Is the image still recognizable as its original source? And again, even though I am an abstract painter, so many of these paintings come from a really explicit source in the world. And in this case, it's another painter's work. So it's almost looking at abstraction as something that is just as real as a figurative painting, right? An abstract painting has as much sort of truth or integrity as a painting that depicts something in a more literal or figurative sense. So at a certain point, I became less interested in this as a painting, and all of these tiny 2-inch canvases were removed. I took them off and I affixed them to another painting, and you can see them here. And then this base substrate became this work. All of these paintings, as I mentioned, are oil, but they do have this kind of buildup of other kinds of paint on the surface, under the surface. And then this is an installation view of that work in the gallery. So I'm going to end these images here. I would like to just express some thanks to the people who have made this show possible, everybody at Freight and Volume, Nick, Ashley, Britt, David, Lisa. I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to the book. In particular, the writers, Laurel McLaughlin, Sarah Stern, Anne-Marie Rooney, and also the contributors of photography, which include my own family members. And I would, of course, like to thank the host of this conversation, which will continue without the sharing of my screen. So the book album functions as a kind of addendum to the in-person viewing experience. I did not want it to be a catalog. I did not want it to document the work in the show. I wanted it to function as, again, a way into thinking about what it means to look. And so the theme, I guess, of the book is a series of page spreads, which are close up and far away images of various spaces. They are often images of sort of cityscapes, in which you have on the left side a 4x6 photograph that is an analog printed out photograph. And then on the right side, you have a full bleed image, which is taken on an iPhone, as this way of saying that digital photography, when taken on an iPhone, can kind of always be scaled up or scaled down. It doesn't have an inherent dimension, which is so different than how, photographs used to, and still are in some cases. But before we had iPhones that could capture everything in a second, we would take photographs with, a disposable camera or a film camera, and we would print them at very specific scales. And so the book has this combination of analog and digital photography. The analog photography dates from 1970 to 2022. And I would like to thank my family for their generous offering to include it in the book. And the book also is, I would say, somewhat literal in the sense that it is there. Often the images are of things in the world, but it's very poetic and abstract in the sense that the paintings really are not paintings of any of these things. There's not a direct sort of connection in why the paintings and the images come together. They're not source material. I'm not, looking at the images and then making paintings. It's more about inviting people to see in a certain way, or inviting people to look in a certain way. I may just at this moment pause with this conversation and engage with Marlo and see if you have any questions you'd like to pose.
Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing your work and the information, insights, and images that you provided. I do have a couple questions before I turn it over to the audience and let them ask questions. One of the questions that comes up for me hearing you present is I keep thinking about the idea of data loss, the language of data loss that you used. And I think about data loss and maybe its presence in the making of the painting. It's the one which the reference was the Mondrian piece, a specific Mondrian piece. And I think about that, and I think about your reference image as being twofold, and one is this experience sitting in front of the painting and documenting and writing, and then also the pixelated image, which for me, as I kind of interpret what you're doing, is an index of Mondrian's original and your experience there, as well as an index of this process of data loss that you seem to be interested in. And data loss, which is, which happens, in the digital realm, and in previous exhibition that you've done, the data loss that happens when looking at an exhibition over the computer or over the phone. And I'm really curious about how you think about your source or your influence, or even maybe your kind of subject or object of investigation. I'm curious is it the Mondrian painting, or is it, the Mondrian painting as well as this kind of abstracted data loss, or the data loss is the thing that you're, the particular phenomena that you're interested in trying to examine and even capture or to record?
Well, I think that's a very you just said, how to capture data loss. It's like, how do you capture absence? How do you capture a negative space? How do you capture it's not there, And actually thinking about my lack of presence on Instagram, how do I kind of call attention to the lack of being in a place or being on a place? So I think that's a really key question that you just posed, is like, how do you capture deterioration and sort of the process of that, but then also what's left behind, which ideally is nothing. And it's, I don't know, I kind of think about a fuzzy image, or an image that never really resolves its own resolution. Like when you are putting a camera up to a subject, you are always losing something. You're either focusing in on the thing that's right in front of the lens, and then the background sort of falls out, or you're focusing on the thing in the back, and what's in front of you really close falls out. And there's the camera's lens can't always reconcile those two things, those two degrees of distance. Our eyes do in this remarkable way. And that's also what's happening when we are standing in a space and we see this sort of peripheral view, even though it's not the thing we're looking right at. There's always this left and right at a certain moment. What's something I've thought about with iPhones is that I think the technology has gotten so good that it's easier to take documentation on an iPhone than it is to take on like a really quote unquote good camera, because the iPhone sort of does all of that work of like fixing the light and fixing the distance and fixing the thing. The camera does that now. And so it creates this sort of hyper image. It creates this like really, really crisp, bright, clean, like color corrected already kind of image. And that's often the thing that gets just posted or shared, or that sort of becomes a better stand-in for the thing itself. Mm-hmm. So to your question about Mondrian, it's like, I don't actually like or dislike Mondrian. I don't really care per se to sort of elevate or shall I say reduce his platform. That's really not my interest or my goal or my role as an artist. My fascination with him is essentially that he is someone that I have looked at and continue to be surprised by, and he has invited me to look in a certain way that has changed the way I think about painting. That's it. There are many artists who have done that, I'm sure, for other people in this room who make. And Mondrian is someone I've just been studying for 5 years in this kind of intense way. So it's about him, and it's also not about him. It's about sort of the place he took me.
Maybe one kind of a follow-up question that I have is, hearing your response, I keep thinking about something that I mean, it's ever present for all of us. I think about entropy and loss, and something about your about particularly this project and even the previous like 2x2 inch paintings. There's a kind of conversation about loss and entropy, and I'm curious, you know, how what language you could add there if you're interested in that kind of conversation, what you would say about entropy, and you know how you experience, how like the specific focus on this particular kind, or entropy here versus there, you know, or over here versus over there. I'm really curious about that and what you would say about it.
Did you say entropy or empathy?
Entropy.
Entropy, because I feel like both words are relevant, empathy and entropy. I think it's about both of those things, but no, I'm actually more interested in entropy, because I think that's everything in painting. And I think what's so peculiar about Mondrian's legacy is that for people, I think, who have not looked at his work in person, he does read as a very methodical, mathematical, precise, geometric painter. And I think that's sort of maybe a turnoff for some people, because some of his work looks like it's cold and was all planned, and that where's the heart or the person in it. But the reality of his paintings, when you look close, is that they're full of entropy. I mean, they're just not these perfect paintings by any means. The brushstrokes are very small and they move in all directions. The use of tape and the fact that he was a hand that could not draw a straight line, you know, I mean, not a computer, but someone who had to tape the edges in order for that line to sort of be attained. They have aged in such a way that the paint is cracking and the surface is slightly discolored. And that's not because they haven't been taken care of. They have obviously been taken care of to the most precise degree within, you know, many museums, but it's the fact of them being paintings that were made now 80 years ago, at least 80 years ago. And that the entropy, not only of him as a painter at the time that he was painting, but the entropy of age, the entropy of 80 years later, we are still living with this painting. And that's a reality that it has undergone, whether, you know, it is, I mean, I would say not weather, but it has undergone the effects of the air and atmosphere around it. And, you know, I think with other paintings that do exist in the sort of living world, for instance, if we think about fresco, if we think about graffiti, if we think about public art at large, that the weather is actually part of the medium. And I think that's beautiful. And the idea that paintings are these things that never change or that always remain sort of in their ideal condition, you know, that's, I understand where that comes from. I think it has a lot to do with value, and especially when paintings accrue market value and become these very like actually monetarily significant things. But the idea that a painting can have a lifetime is beautiful to me. And so entropy is just something I think we just have to be observant of and to harness, as opposed to try to resist it.
Thank you for that. I do want to now, I have other questions, but I will hold those for now. I do want to turn it over to the audience. I think there's at least one hand raised. For folks in the audience, you can ask questions. If you don't feel comfortable sharing your voice on the platform, you can send your question via the chat to myself or Julia, either of the who are labeled as hosts. You can send your questions there. We'll reread them for the audience, and then Julia will answer. But there's somebody, I'll ask you to unmute. You can go ahead and unmute and ask questions to Julia directly.
Hi, I'm Trisha Kim. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really exciting to hear about your practice, Julia, and kind of how you're thinking about, where you situate your practice, sort of within an art, like the longer arc of art history, if that makes sense, but also sort of at present. I have sort of a half-baked question that returns to this point you make about painting and kind of, what is, and I say this with love, so if it comes out, weird, please forgive me, but kind of what is the use of painting, or what is the point of painting nowadays, especially with kind of all these different devices and modes of looking that have entered into our worlds. And so I was really struck by how you described your own painting and your own works, sort of thinking and playing with scale and kind of trying to foster a sense of interactivity and activeness, right? And it really reminded me of the ways in which a lot of folks describe sculpture, for example, or performance. And so I guess it got me thinking about painting as a particular kind of medium that is distinct. And so I was wondering if you could maybe share some of your thoughts about painting as a medium as distinctive, or as distinct from sculpture, performance, 2D, like digital stuff and so on. But also perhaps it's sort of like in a playful way is sort of edging, close to those mediums. I'll just stop now. I hope my question is clear, and thank you again so much to you and to Ernest.
I love your question, and it's like a question that I think about all the time, and I love everything that you said about those other mediums also. I mean, I actually feel like I came to painting believing that it also was and I'll say this. I'll talk about fresco as a form of painting that I think allows for it to be something other than just itself. A fresco is a material that was often embedded within an actual architectural space. And right then and there, the idea that painting does exist in the real world, it exists with a function that often was about education. It was about sort of bringing people into the fold in certain religious spaces. Today, obviously that's a dated reference, but for me today, I think painting is one of the ways that, and this sounds very lofty and sort of maybe meta, but I think it is a way for us to remain human. I mean, I really believe that when you look at a painting, it's very, very distinct and different than looking at any other kind of image. And a painting is not an image. It is a surface that has many, many layers underneath it. And yet it also reads as an image at the same time. Like a painting sort of teeters between being an image and being this other thing. It's like both an illusion and it is an object. And in a time where we are constantly questioning, like, what is real, what is not real, what is true, what is not true, like, I think a painting has a particular capacity to address those questions, right? Like a painting is an illusion, and at the same time it is a real thing. And it doesn't make, like, it's not right or wrong. Paintings are not like right or wrong. Paintings are they don't make value judgments. They maintain their integrity without saying, like, without shutting ideas out. I mean, even a painting that you might disagree with the sort of message behind, it still allows us to see how a particular person at a particular point in history thought about something. And I think it's extremely valuable, like almost as a form of evidence for the ways that people have seen themselves and seen others throughout history. So I would say, like, paintings still do something that no other medium can. And I would say just see as many as you can in person and see what they do to you. And not all paintings are successful, not all art forms are successful, but I think they're an invitation to feel and to make decisions about the thing in front of you, how you feel about it, what you think about it.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I see another hand up. Let me go ahead and ask to unmute. I believe that's David.
Well, I just want to say that this point you're getting at right now, I know it is seems a little bit difficult to talk about without sounding overly, pronunciatory about things, but I think you are onto something, and I think it does have a lot to do with the painting, not so much as a fixed image, but as a presence. It's a physical presence, and as you say, in your attitude towards making, they arise out of questions. They are there, and we are there with them, and we see them from within our own body. And that engagement becomes a kind of a two-way street. I don't think painting is necessarily any more or less privileged than any other medium, but since you are approaching it with that particular attitude, I find that to be at least potentially powerfully accessible, and I'm seeing that in some of the work too that you're showing us. So I just want to encourage, there's something about that point that has a lot to do with an attitude about being with the work. And that's a big part of what it's for me. And even though we might see a lot of work, we don't necessarily see a lot of work that comes at it from that attitude or engages in quite that way. So as hard as it is to pin down with any specificity what that's about, I do think you're touching at what to me is one of the most viable and vital aspects of this work. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll also say that, to that point, painting historically has served a very explicit purpose, and often that was a purpose of educating. And I think the fact that painting no longer really aspires to or is tasked with that burden, there is a certain amount of leverage and maybe ability to I would say that's a burden, right? And when a medium is no longer the thing that must be used for this thing, I think that's a great gift and a great opportunity. And I think the fact that people are still making paintings despite all of these other modes that make reality, captured in other ways, like, I think that's just information that we should pay attention to. Like, people still want to do this thing, and not and I would agree with you. It's not just about painting. I mean, any other medium, sculpture, video, photography, like all of these things, they have their own versions of what we're saying. As someone who doesn't use those mediums, I don't want to speak for those individuals who do, but yeah. Thank you.
Mhm. Other questions? I'm looking in the roster if there are other hands up. Okay, I don't see another hand up. Oh, okay, Elizabeth, I can't find your name, but you can go ahead and unmute. Oh, I see. Okay.
Hi, thank you. And I'll start video. Okay, so Julia, you can see who you're talking to. I don't know if this is a question, but maybe you can speak to it, which is that the painting, especially the painting that is the painting that you had the small 2 by 2 inch paintings of Mondrian on, and then you took them off. And the painting looks like it has buckles on it. It's kind of wrapped. And then with your discussion about, well, I guess the word that comes to my mind is conservation, like you're conserving. Sorry, I've never used Zoom on the iPhone before. So that the word conservation comes to mind because it's as if painting begins for you as an inquiry and a perceptual investigation. And then at that point, when you take off the Mondrians, you're almost wiping the field clean and then moving in with this other kind of process. And I'm curious about that process because it's like an embedding or a conserving of the inquiry method itself, almost like a science. Okay, thanks. That's my question. And congratulations on the show.
I love that. I love that two-part question and sort of observation. Yeah, well, something that one of my good friends and fellow artists and colleagues has always reminded me of is like how, again, how kind of heavy the history of painting is, and like how there's just, I mean, this is the case for any medium, but for whatever reason, painting feels like it's like extremely burdened by its own history. And, it's like you have all these people in the room, and Philip Guston will always say this. He's like, you have to like, everybody starts in the room. Your parents start in the room, your teachers start in the room, all the other painters in history, like everybody is in the room. And then at a certain point, you start gradually like pushing them out of the room, and then you shut the room, and then you're the only one in the room. And then actually you leave the room, and the only thing that's in the room is the painting. And so I guess this thing with the Mondrian pieces kind of starting, it's like that's quite literally just like, okay, here I am with him. And the form of copying a certain work is always something that I respond to as like I'm never going to make anything, like to go in thinking that you're going to make something like novel or great or different, like just I can't go in that way. So I go in often with a source, with something that exists outside of myself in the world. And in this case, like it's very helpful to start with that as a kind of armature. And someone recently asked me if you could do it again, like if you could make this painting again, would you still kind of go through that belabored method of like undoing that? Because actually it's like really time consuming, it's inefficient, it's like a lot of wasted material, but it's like actually, yes, like there is no, like the process of doing that is how the painting happened. It's not like the point of the painting is to just get to the end. That's not the point. So it's like all of the kind of, all of the things that you note on the canvas when you see it up close, you note that there was something there that was pulled off. You note that there are parts of it that were torn. You note that it's like, this looks like this like collaged thing. All of those are realities of its making. They are scars of its making. They are whatever you want to call them. And that all goes into how that painting translates to a person. And I guess I just believe in the sort of transparency of the way something happened being part of what it is that we read. It's like an image is almost like beside the point, even though it is the point, but it also, it's just like it and that's part of why the initial painting that begins the show album, the stop motion painting, was really this this sort of goal to be really forthright with my audience as to how this thing was made. And it's something I think about a lot with, working in artist studios, working in museums, like what is the information that we have about the artist and what do we not have? And often artists, don't want to show us all that backstory. I think it's really generous when an artist does. And sometimes the only way you get to do that is when you work in these spaces. And I've had a lot of jobs where I've seen all of the actual backstory. And as my own maker now, I want people to be a part of that to some degree. So thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Other questions from folks? We still have a little bit more time left. Let me look.
Yes, Ernest, I don't know if I'm unmuted or,
You're unmuted. You go ahead.
yeah, just wanted to say, Julia and Ernest, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and enlightening description and tour through your work, Julia. It's been exciting to watch you develop from the show we did uptown in Harlem and now bigger scale in Tribeca. And the trajectory has been really extraordinary. From our discussion on iPhone size paintings to large scale, what do you think your next direction will be? And also, thank you for all participating on such an incredibly cold day. It's been quite an adventure. But where do you see this work taking you at this point?
Thank you for that question, Nick. And thank you also for just the faith in this work over the course of its making. I mean, I think it was back in 2019 maybe that we had that initial conversation about 2-inch paintings. It was like at your space on the Lower East Side, and it's just been this journey of kind of having this work come to life. So thank you. And that's a good question. What is the next part of this work? I have become really invested in, again, this kind of like chasm between the big and the small. I think it has allowed me to calibrate my body very differently when I am working on both of those things at the same time. In the immediate future, I'm going to be doing a project with this painting, Green Space. The painting is called Green Screen. So it was a freestanding painting. This is a picture of it, again, at Art Space in New Haven. This was a show curated by Laurel, who is one of the contributing writers to the book. So thank you, Laurel. And this painting sits on these cast iron bench legs. So it's almost like this anthropomorphic idea for a painting to like sit on benches. It was a painting that was conceived of as a actual functional green screen. And this painting is going to be the sort of basis for a project that I'm doing in collaboration with the New York Public Library and Bryant Park. It's funded, as I mentioned at the beginning, by the Rima Hortman Foundation's Artist Community Engagement Grant. And the vision for it is that the painting serves as a backdrop for a group of high school students who I'll be working with that will be kind of creating their own alternative environments using images from the New York City picture collection, or the New York City Public Library's picture collection, which is an analog archive of images. So I'm going to be working with these students to sort of create collages and backgrounds that will then be inserted in the space of this painting. I want to continue making paintings that people can have a relationship to as the objects that they were, meant to be, but then also a relationship that is more like active and engaged. And I think that painting has just, again, this capacity to do that.
Very exciting, and I think they definitely are becoming more sculptural from what I can see on that last example.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to see. Actually, this painting, yeah, there's a back side to it. So I'll show you the back side of the painting. This is the back of it. So the front is green, and then the back is the kind of opposite side of the color spectrum. And those little tiny squares are cutouts, which actually project light through them on the wall. Here's a picture of it as it was installed. And it's freestanding, and then it casts light on either side. And these little holes, again, create these sort of shadows. So it is, it is very much of a sculpture, of an installation, and it is also very much a painting. It's trying to be all those things at once.
One last addendum to that question.
Yeah.
We're looking at, you discussed a lot of Mondrian being the backdrop. That's the starting point for a lot of your paintings. If one were to x-ray your paintings, would they see the layers of Mondrian in the background as you from a starting point or different layers as you proceed? Because they change so radically from the beginning to the end.
I also love that question, because yes, you do. And that's something that I have taken note of when museums have done exhibitions of artists and they have included X-ray. There was a show at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum about a year ago of Titian, and they had there was a series of these paintings in the gallery, but then they had a huge amount of information about the conservation and the production of these paintings. And part of what they discovered is, ways that he had thought about the composition, and they had x-rays of, placement of certain figures. They also, I think, discovered that one of the paintings was actually cut, and there was only, I think, one image of like a previous full version of it. So the work of conservators fascinates me, and I try to talk to them. I was very grateful to be able to talk to Annie Averam, who's the painting conservator at MoMA, about this painting of Mondrian's in particular, and also Jim Coddington, who used to also be a painting conservator at MoMA, and they have just given me so much insight that as a viewer I could not know. So yes, like absolutely, I love the idea of paintings being x-rayed, and it's a crazy it's remarkable that we have the capacity to do that, and I don't think those painters would have ever imagined it to be possible. So
yeah, it's a fascinating area. Thanks for that, Julia.
yes, thank you.
Okay, other hands for questions? I'm looking through our roster again. Okay.
Marlo,
I
do you
have
have any other questions
I
from?
do.
I just want to thank you for
I
your.
do have another question I can ask. And a part of the question is, it's related to your work, and also, like how you're dealing with entropy and loss and data loss. And in your statement, there seems to be a kind of relationship with digital technology, right? This form of capturing an image or creating an image, which is different from how images are produced through painting, and also how images are viewed, whether they're viewed digitally or they're viewed in real time in space, where there's all of that other information. And you describe it as a kind of, quote, tenuous coexistence with digital media and analog media. There's a kind of tenuous coexistence there. And I'm curious about, for example, the painting, what is the title? The painting titled Album, with the QR code image, does participate in this relationship with digital media, or what one might say as more contemporary forms of creating images or even augmenting images. And I'm curious about that relationship, because for me, there seems to be something present in the discourse that you're participating in, which is a kind of critique of the screen and what the screen does to the act of viewing a work in person. As a maker, you can tell who is an artist and who is not. When you go to the museum, the artists are like right up against the painting, and the connoisseurs are far back from the painting, because the artists know that there is all of that extra information that's there for them to lap up, and that painting for me particularly participates in a particular way. It does participate with digital media, and also you have the moving image, and then also you have the record of how the image was then produced, which is all of this other information, which, the digital realm is opening up that kind of the possibility for that conversation, versus the analog realm. The possibility for that conversation is not necessarily there. It's there for makers, but it's not there for a general viewer. And so I'm curious about that act of participation and how you view yourself in that space, and maybe other things that you may decide to do within that space or with digital media in the future.
Yeah, well, I think, again, I don't think my role as an artist is to make, like, people sometimes ask, like, are you concerned about these things like AI and, like, I mean, yes, like, I'm concerned, but my role as an artist is to I say coexist because I cannot prevent or, like, I guess my role is not to prevent things or to ignore them or to pretend they're not there, but rather to say these things are here. Now, what do I do with them? I mean, there are some people who task themselves with, uh, the kind of, I mean, I think artists are, like, have an incredible power to sort of shift the current, but also they do it in a particular kind of way. And one of the ways they do it is that they observe the world, they observe what they see in the world, and then they deal with that reality through the making of their objects. And so the thing about album is that it's, it's saying, like, yes, look at this painting. This painting is in the window, you can see it. But also when you hold your phone up to it, which you probably are holding because everybody's often holding their phone, like, it asks, or it prompts you to use that phone as you would have normally done, which is often to take a picture of something. And when you do hold your phone up, it takes you to this other place. And so the phone takes you to a video because the phone reads the QR code and says, oh, this is how I, like, the painting is telling the phone how to perform. The painting is also telling you how to perform, and your phone is telling you how to perform. So we're kind of in this, like, three-way relationship. And I guess I'm not trying to, like, prevent or, like, accelerate as much as just sort of sit with the reality of this situation and say, okay, so, like, how do I slightly push or pull, and I also am really interested in the idea that technology, as I said before, paintings can have a lifespan and technology has a lifespan. There's going to be a point at which the iPhone will no longer exist, or any handheld device will no longer exist, because there will be something else that does exist. And then there will also be a point at which the QR code will perhaps not work, or the link will be broken. And then what do we do with that? So this idea of permanence and then also deterioration is at the core of all of this, I believe, and we talk about, like, technology having built-in obsolescence. I mean, that's, like, part of the ways these companies make money is they build in a time life or a lifespan for the devices, at which point they will no longer work and you have to buy another one. So I'm not, like, coming to a conclusion about any of it. I'm just posing these things in the way I work. And yeah, I hope that's somewhat of an answer to your question.
Thank you. There is another hand up. You can go ahead and unmute.
Hi. Yeah, I was in the gallery and we were talking about the sort of the more sinister aspects of the QR code in relation to collection of data, all the data mining that goes on by the corporations, the way the data is used. It's a kind of a democratic issue. I had a friend who, Alberto Gaitan, who's an artist who did a piece called Remembrancer, in which he had these machines that would paint on these canvases each time something happened at a certain place in the world. And it was all hooked into the internet to get events. Then he did another one that followed him around using his phone and followed him around. And then he had a device that would record everything that he was doing as he was being followed. So, I mean, that naturally comes up when I see your work. For me, it naturally came up, but you're not as interested in that in particular, or how does that affect you?
Well, I would say that I see collaboration as an important, to this question of, like, what's next. I think that I would love to work with people who find their medium to be more in the digital world, because it's not something that I am particularly well versed in, even as I am, like, again, like working with and against it to some degree. Like, I would love to have the kind of insight and expertise and creative um process of someone who is sort of using these in their own way. um like, if you're asking, would I want to go down that path myself? No, but I am interested in collaborating with people who are asking that question in their own work in a way that sort of touches on what I do.
I was more thinking about just the aspect that when I saw the work, what immediately comes up is issues about digital culture, particularly corporate digital culture and society, and the democratic issues of that.
Yes.
And I was wondering how that played out. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned Alberto's work, but that's more what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've done a lot of research and projects that specifically look into the corporations of Facebook, or now Meta, of Twitter, of the kind of algorithmic technology that designs these spaces, and that, again,
SEO. Mhm.
yeah, and that is, it's as a, it's sometimes it feels like it is hard to both be in the studio making these paintings and then also to be doing this research. I mean, in a way, I kind of want it to be a separate thing. Like, I want to I'm in the process of interviewing artists about their relationship to technology. And I would also like that to include people who work within the tech world and who are coders. Like, but it sort of feels like it's I want it to be a book. I don't know if it needs to exist in the space of the paintings, because I think there's so much in there that I actually just want to be in, like, as language.
Yeah.
So, like, yes, so much, and I would happily have a conversation with you about that in a separate yeah, so, like, 100%. And I have a lot of books that I could, like, put in the chat that really call on this. One just comes to mind, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. Algorithms of Oppression is another book. The Hype Machine. I mean, all of these books really touch on the sort of ethics behind the way these corporations have created the technology that we are so dependent on now.
Mhm.
And so I am very concerned about it. Yes.
Thanks.
So we probably have enough time for one more short question, and then we will close out for the evening. Let me look and see if I can find another hand. Okay, I don't see another hand up. Okay, so I'm going to do this. Thank you all for coming. I'll do two things. If this is your first time being present for a criticism and value lecture or conversations, if you'd like to be on the guest list, I dropped a link in the chat. You can click the link. You can join via Instagram. Most of the information is disseminated there, as well as you can submit your email to be added to a mailing list. That email is info@criticismandvalue.com. If you have questions, comments, even criticisms about the platform, you can send all that information to the email directly. I want to thank you all again for coming. Before we leave, Julia, if you have events coming up that you'd like to share with the audience, as well as share information about, I believe you have a book release coming, a book signing coming up, and other events, how can folks get a hold of you?
Yes. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to drop in the chat a link to the book, which again is called Album, and we will be doing an in-person book signing and just kind of closing on the last day of the show, which is Saturday, February 18th. So I encourage you to come for that. It will be just kind of a closing, and the book will be available for purchase there. It is also available in this link online. The gallery again is 39 Lispenard Street. So if you find yourself in Tribeca and haven't already seen the show, I encourage you to stop by. What else can I say? I don't know if I'm leaving anything out from the upcoming events. But I do want to say thank you again to everybody at the gallery, Britt, David, Ashley, Lisa, Nick, and the contributors to the book, Sarah, Laurel, Anne Marie, my collaborator in New Orleans, Sly, and of course you, Ernest and Marlo, for your presence in the virtual world and also in the real world. And to, I should say thank you to Mondrian as well. Anything else that we should close out with before we say goodnight?
No, I think that is it, unless there's that other question. Let me just double check in the chat. Okay, no, I don't see any question. Oh, there is one more. There's one. Is that a wave goodbye or is that a wave for question?
Question.
Oh, okay. Your final question.
Well, it's not even a question, but I just want to say, after all the theoretical talk and all and how you got there and why you did that and that, the bottom line for me is looking at those paintings and seeing a human being put oil on a canvas and doing it in a way that's exuberant to me. So it's not like I'm not interested in all that other stuff, but the bottom line is I'm looking at a painting, somebody spent hours putting oil and color there this way and that way, and that's the exhilaration for me. And I thank you for that. That's all. Oh, Julia, what time is the book signing on the 18th?
4 to 6. The gallery will be open that whole day, 11 to 6. I'll be there starting around 4, and I am happy to, you know, sign any books and just talk more about the show and raise a glass of thank you to everybody who has made this exhibition possible and anybody who has come to see it. And on that note, Jill, I want to say thank you and thank everybody who takes the time to look, because looking is, you know, we are so oversaturated with things these days, with things coming our way, and attention and focus are actually really, we can't take them for granted. So anybody who takes the time to look, I'm grateful for that.
Super. That is a fantastically nice way to end for this evening. Thank you all again. Stay on the lookout for the next Criticism and Value event. It will be installation number 10. I hope to have you all back again. Thank you all again. Thank you, Julia. And have a good evening.